Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Now, as U.S. President Donald Trump's administration continues its crackdown on undocumented immigrants, it now has introduced a fast-track deportation process that will bypass the courts and allow the government to send undocumented migrants back to their country of origin. This is just the latest in a series of moves aimed at undermining human rights and denying asylum to those who need it the most. On tonight's show, let's find out more about this developing story. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Fein, a former Associate Deputy Attorney General of the United States and constitutional and international law expert and lawyer. He's joining us from the District of Columbia. We're also joined by Mr. Antony Loewenstein, who's a journalist joining us from Jerusalem. Thank you both for joining us. Now, Mr. Fein, let me begin with you. Give us a sense of how this new policy is going to change the already very confusing and complex crisis at the southern border and across the United States when it comes to migration.
I want to begin by identifying what the current law is with regard to seeking asylum status. Under international conventions and United States law, an immigrant would need to show by a preponderance of evidence that there's a likelihood of persecution if they were returned to their country of origin based upon race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, or membership in a social group. Now, that determination is highly fact-specific, and under traditional enforcement protocols, that decision is made by an immigration judge. And the change that the Trump administration is inaugurating, and it is authorized by a 1996 law passed by a Democratic Congress when President Bill Clinton was president, authorizes a more expedited review process of an asylum claim made by persons who are lower down on the official rung than a judge, for those who cannot prove that they have been in the United States for at least 2 years or more. That oftentimes is very difficult. If you're in an immigration status, you don't necessarily are collecting rent stubs and things like that.
Right.
The idea is to accelerate the decision-making on deportation, which now has got a logjam of approaching 1 million cases.
So this means that you're taking out the court's rule completely from this picture.
Well, it means that there is, in the legal terminology, less due process. You're entrusting the decision whether or not a valid asylum claim has been made to lower-level officials who are probably less schooled in the law. And I think given the administrative signals the Trump administration is sending, they're being encouraged to err on the side of denying asylum than accepting claims of likely persecution if returned to the country of origin.
Right. Mr. Loewenstein, on the point of human rights and basic human rights, how important is due process and reducing this in the system in this manner, knowing that these migrants, many of which are fleeing from Central American countries, from conflict, what impact does that have on the very basic fundamental human rights?
It's a huge difference, and I think it's important to put the context into this question, that what the US is doing, in fact, sadly, plays into a broader global role. The US obviously is the world's biggest, most powerful nation, so of course what happens there is covered around the world, including on this program. What the US is doing is not the first place to be doing that. I'm from Australia, although I live in Jerusalem now. And Australia's immigration policy and parts of European refugee policy is remarkably similar in the last 10, 20 years to what the US is doing. I think it's important also to remember that increasingly Western states are keen to get rid of people who they view as unwanted, undesirable, brown or Muslim. That is the basic ugly fact. And in Australia, we've seen that for 2 decades, where refugees are held often for years and years and years in Pacific gulags. The European Union is increasingly not putting any boats to patrol the Mediterranean, and people are drowning in the sea who are trying to escape from the Middle East or Africa. And what the US is doing is willfully, under the Trump administration, ignoring the fact that its own country and foreign policy, whether Democrat or Republican, has deeply affected the reason why people are fleeing Central America in the first place. I was in Honduras, as a short example, a few years ago for work. And many of the refugees who are coming into the US, or at least trying to, are from Honduras. And in the last roughly 35, 40 years, US foreign policy in Honduras has made that country into one of the most violent nations on the planet. Gang violence, drug violence, etc. It makes perfect sense that someone wants to flee a country like Honduras and come, say, to the US. So the effect of a Trump administration making it more difficult for people to come doesn't actually solve the problem. It simply keeps it potentially out of US borders, but it just moves the problem somewhere else.
Right, and that is a very, very essential point that should be remembered in debates and arguments such as these, that you should contextualize where these people are coming from, who is behind the problems being created in those areas. Another update from what is happening on the migration front is that Trump has announced to place sanctions on Mexico and Guatemala, who are pulling out of a previous agreement they had with the United States. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think what you've seen here is Mexico being put in, frankly, an impossible position. This is not to defend Mexican policy by any means, but essentially this did not start with the Trump administration. During the Obama years, there were massive pressures by the Obama team on Mexico to try to keep refugees from entering the US. Many Mexicans were sent back. And the truth is, just in fact last month, in June 2019, figures released by the Mexican government said that it's one of the most violent first 6 months ever recorded in Mexican history. That's from gun and drug violence. In other words, putting aside refugees who are entering Mexico, we're talking about Mexicans themselves who are being violently abused and killed for a range of reasons, gun violence, drug violence, all that sort of thing. So I think there's new policies by the Trump administration essentially is trying to push the problem away from US borders so the Trump administration coming up to the 2020 election can say, you see, America, we've solved the problem, we're kicking out all these unwanted and brown people, frankly, and they're now a Mexican or Guatemalan problem, which doesn't solve anything except it potentially allows Trump to push a very harder white nationalist agenda.
Right, and that's a very dangerous path that the country seems to be going on. But before that, I want to talk more about what is happening at the border. And Mr. Fein, I want to get your on this. Now, a lot of analysts, a lot of people are saying that the Trump administration is manufacturing a crisis, something that Mr. Loewenstein also talked about here. But I want your take on it.
He certainly inflated the description of the problem of immigration that has been long-standing from prior administrations, and claiming it's a crisis where most people don't perceive it as a crisis whatsoever, including those who are on the border. I do think, however, it's important to be complete in understanding the problem. Even if a person is fleeing a country because there's violence, there's death threats, under the current asylum law that was drafted in the conventions after World War II, that doesn't qualify as a justification for refugee status. If that were to occur, it requires an act of Congress or a change in the convention. So I think a lot of the criticism, really, and I'm certainly not a defender of Mr. Trump, is a criticism of the existing law that has been applied and is too narrow in its application. Right. If you're just trying to create refugee status for people who are fleeing great danger. And to blame it all on Mr. Trump, I think, is an incomplete assessment here. Even under President Obama, he was doing basically the same thing, but having a little less aggressive enforcement. Now, what does this say about the problem itself? It has been around for at least 40 or 50 years. When I first came to the Department of Justice in 1975, I sat on a group called the Interagency Commission on Illegal Immigration. The dimensions of the problem were virtually the same. The fact is that people will come, just like drugs will, if it's necessary for survival and if they have a financial need. And because employers in the United States like cheap labor, they will have the demand so that most of these immigrants do come. They're not on welfare. They have jobs. They send remittances. It's a little bit like trying to fight the international drug trafficking, trillions of dollars, but the international drug trafficking persists. There are some problems that you can only muddle through with. There isn't any real solution.
Right. Right. But you've talked about how the law plays into this. Something I do want to touch upon, and I want you to enlighten the viewers and myself more about it, is what rights in the United States specifically do undocumented migrants actually have? I mean, there's a campaign going about by Democrats, young Democrats, know your rights, right before the ICE raids begin. What does this entail? Are there any rights for undocumented migrants?
Yes, there are. In fact, there was a famous case called Plyler v. Doe, which I was involved in at the time, which holds that if you're an illegal immigrant child, you still have a right to free public education. Now, with regard to deportation hearings, you have rights as an immigrant. You haven't been determined illegal until there's been due process to have your case adjudicated by an immigration judge. It's not an independent Article III judge. It's part of the administrative machinery, but at least have an opportunity to prove that you fall within one of these asylum categories. Now, what the administration is doing is scaling back somewhat the level and intensity of that due process hearing. But that is enshrined in the law. And in fact, several of the Trump initiatives are now being stalled because federal judges have held that they transgress on due process that's in the immigration statutes.
Right. Mr. Loewenstein, let's juxtapose what Mr. Fein told us about all the legalities, all the laws, all the protections, all the complexities with the human picture of this matter. Let's put it side by side with what we hear about the frightening stories coming out of the detention centers at the southern border. What do people need to remember about this?
The detention camps that exist, not just along the border, but also across much of the US, has been a blight on the US for decades. And in fact, similar policies in the US are copied in the UK, Europe, and my country, Australia. These often are privately run. They run for profit. And in fact, during the 2016 US election, the private prison and immigration companies, in fact, were excited about a Trump victory because they knew that if Trump won, they would have far more people to actually house in their facilities. And they were correct. Their share prices have gone through the roof. And what does that mean practically? It means that these facilities often are poorly run. Food is bad. Healthcare is often non-existent. Children often are separated from their parents, very, very young children separated from their parents, to the point where still today, after there was a big scandal in 2018 last year of all these kids who were separated parents, to this day, the Trump administration admits in various court filings, they actually don't know where some of the children are who are separated from their parents. That doesn't mean the children are dead. It simply means that the parents are not with their kids, which is outrageous, to put it mildly. Right. And although there were definitely degrees of family separation during the Obama administration, as Mr. Fein rightly says, Trump has sort of put it on steroids, accelerated this kind of brutality. So the facilities themselves are brutal, but of course this in some ways is the point. That is exactly what the system is designed to do. It's designed to make it hard. It's designed to make your life impossible. And why? Because then immigrants who are in the US, in this center, say to their family back in Honduras, do not come. That's the theory. And that's the theory, the so-called deterrent theory that the US has been using for years, the UK, Australia. Now, I would argue that doesn't particularly work. In the short term, potentially it can. You can literally shut the border, for example. The US can do that. Australia, of course, is an island. But the US could theoretically shut its border. I don't think it's about to, although Trump has threatened that. But it doesn't solve any of the problems. The UN released just recently that there's over 70 million refugees in the world today. It's the highest number since World War II. Now, these figures are because of a range of reasons, the wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, countless other reasons. These issues are not going anywhere. So, yes, the US can build higher walls and borders and more surveillance, all that kind of stuff. You can do that. It doesn't solve any of the problems unless you're simply doing it to push a political point, which namely is, I would argue, a white nationalist agenda.
Right. Mr. Fein, going back to you and putting out a very large question, but also wanting to get an answer to it, finding an answer to it. During all of this, during all the laws, all the policies that the Trump administration has placed on migration and those that existed previously before Trump and have continued to be placed, how many of these are infringing upon the basic human rights and freedoms that the U.S. prides itself on?
Well, the U.S. prides itself on subscribing to the rule of law. And I don't believe that simply applying the law, even though it's too narrow, necessarily is a renunciation of universal human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948, which is the so-called gold standard, if you will, of human rights gospel, does not prescribe, a right to asylum. That is a right that came about by a separate convention. It's a treaty, and we have adopted statutes that implement it. But I say that convention confines the asylum right to those who are fleeing persecution based upon race, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, or membership in a social group. It doesn't apply to the substantial number who are fleeing just dangerous conditions in their own countries because of drug trafficking, lawlessness.
But aren't those dangerous conditions actually, in fact, a threat to their lives? I mean, isn't that what persecution and conflict is, when it's threatening your life and your existence?
It is persecution, but it's not persecution based upon race, nationality, political opinion, religion, or membership in a social group, because the international conventions don't cover all threats, all egregious circumstances. Now,
so
you can change it to be
definition
right
needs
now,
to be revisited?
Excuse me?
Would you say that this definition needs to be revisited and reworked?
Yes, I do believe that's true. I think that the initial convention was drafted with the idea in mind of the Jews seeking refuge from the Holocaust, if you will, the persecution of the Nazis. And it was drafted, I think, narrowly to meet those circumstances. I would agree with you. I think that anybody who's fleeing for their life ought to be welcomed. As long as they come in, they're law-abiding, and they want to be a citizen and subscribe to the Constitution of the United States. But we still have to stick with the rule of law. That's up to Congress to be certain. And the Congress of the United States, even the House controlled by the Democrats, have not proposed such an extension.
Right. And on that note, thank you so much, Mr. Fein, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion with another topic. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Following a meeting amongst the foreign affairs and interior ministers of the EU in Paris earlier this week, French President Emmanuel Macron announced the 14 member states agreed upon mechanisms to deal with migrants coming to Europe. Now, since the start of the year, the International Organization for Migration estimates that some 700 migrants died while trying to cross the Mediterranean. While the number of migrant deaths is declining in comparison to past years, human rights organizations say that the European nations continue to turn a blind eye to the plight of those thousands of people who risk their lives while traveling across the Mediterranean, leaving everything behind. On today's show, we discuss whether this agreement between the EU states will change anything for the migrants at sea, or will this just turn stale while no practical steps are taken. Joining us for this discussion today is Mr. Joel Schalit, who's a journalist and editor specialized in migration and diversity politics in Europe. He's joining us from Berlin. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show, Mr. Schalit. Now, what do you make of this decision of the French government with 14 other European states? Do you think this will change anything when it comes to migration policies all over the EU?
No, I don't think so. I think what it's doing is it's codifying the fact that there will always be a limited number of EU member states who take in migrants. And the states that officially lined up, that have been disclosed in the Macron plan, are typically more liberal, more cosmopolitan, center-left countries than those that are currently known to reject immigration outright, whether they be refugees or regular economic migrants. Portugal is an exceptionally progressive country by EU standards right now, so it's no surprise that they would indicate that that they would welcome refugees and migrants, for example, from the Middle East. Poland obviously has not lined up, and it is not expected that it will. There is an East-West divide on the migration question in Europe. Italy is the only country which approximates politically the eastern side of the political divide on migration, and it is a relatively new positioning for Italy. Italy was not known for its fierce anti-immigration politics under the previous Partito Democratico-led government that was replaced a year ago last June.
Right. And Mr. Schalit, I do want to talk about how this demonstrates, this migrant agreement might demonstrate actually a deep, deep divide amongst the European states. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Antony Loewenstein and talk to him about the crisis at sea. The numbers we hear are appalling. The pictures we see are frightening. So many people gathered on these boats, crossing over, risking their lives. Tell us about what is happening on that front.
Look, the EU has sadly adopted what I would call an offshoring Australian-style policy, and Australia sadly were masters of this in the last 20 years. What I mean is that they've outsourced their refugee problem to countries in Africa, Libya being the most obvious one, but also Niger. And what that means is that they've massively reduced the amount of money they're willing to spend on rescuing people at sea. In the last few years, they've decided, after the huge influx of about 1 million or so refugees in 2015, many of whom are welcomed, of course, by Germany, that politically that's become unattractive now, so the EU believes. And as Mr. Schalit rightly said, there's no consensus in Europe, and there won't be any consensus about this for the foreseeable future because of the East-West divide. So therefore, what that means is that the EU has decided to offshore its problems, so to speak, to Libya. Libya is a failed state. It's in the middle of a war zone. Many refugees are sent there to Libya to be housed in literally torture camps. There are slave markets in Libya. The EU is funding these facilities. That's what the EU thinks should happen to refugees. If you ask them directly, of course, they say they're opposed to Libyan abuses and it's terrible and they would never support that. That's where European money is going. So on the one hand, they're offshoring their problem to a non-European country. And France is also, I might add, trying to manage refugees in Niger, another very poor African country, while at the same time they're reducing the amount of money they're spending on sea rescues. The effect of that's very obvious, right? A lot of people are dying. And frankly, the European authorities don't care. What message
do you think the European authorities want to send out to these migrants? There has to be a message behind this when they are doing all of this so rashly.
The message to me is an ugly one. It's basically, don't come. Don't come. Stay where you are, stay in danger, whether it's Africa or the Middle East, ignoring, as we talked about before, the role of the US in Latin and Central America. Who do you think's causing so many of the problems in Africa and the Middle East? It's not solely Europe, of course it's not. But a lot of the wars that have caused these problems in much of the Middle East have European and British fingerprints on them. They're not simply Afghanistan or Iraq didn't suddenly just start a war for no reason. We all know how that happened in the last 15, 20 years. So the message from the EU is very clear. Yes, we welcomed many of you in the last 4 or 5 years. Those days are over. The walls are going up. Surveillance is going up. And the fact is we don't want you here. And the truth is that's going to make it increasingly difficult for people trying to enter from Africa and the Middle East. But like we see in the US, it won't stop people trying because often they're really desperate to do so.
Right. Mr. Schalit, following from everything that Mr. Loewenstein has pointed out here, it seems like the message is loud and clear. Then whenever European states try to work out a policy, work on their immigration stance, is that just a facade?
No, it's not. I worked in Brussels during the height of the refugee crisis. And while I had many disagreements with the European Commission's proposed refugee policies, I do believe that if the European Commission had had its way and had prevailed over the heads of the Eastern member state governments that opposed any kind of quota system for refugees arriving in Southern Europe and the Balkans, the situation today would be significantly better, and the policies that the Commission would have moved to adopt would have been different. I don't necessarily believe that the European Commission is a benign liberal institution, but it would have executed more liberal policies if it had the political room to do so at the time of the refugee crisis. The fact of the matter is that the European Commission has to reflect the consensus of the member states of the European Union. And the newer member states are politically to the far right. They're nationalist, they're racist, and their politics on the refugee question determined the European Commission's ultimate policy-making decisions, particularly, as Mr. Loewenstein put it, offshoring, in terms of offshoring the refugee crisis. The major problem for Europe that particularly the Americans don't seem to quite understand is that whenever there's a crisis in the Middle East, Europe tends to feel it first in terms of the human cost.
Let me put this question to you. Picking off from some of the last words he mentioned here, that whenever there seems to be a crisis in the Middle East, Americans don't understand the cost that the Europeans will have to suffer. Now, we talked earlier about how the U.S. might be inflating the crisis at hand when it comes to its borders. Do you think Europe inflates in any way the migrant crisis, or is there in fact a crisis?
I would say there is a crisis. I guess it depends how you define what crisis means. But the truth is that in the last years, there have been major Middle East and African wars and famine, and for the cause of either man-made wars or climate change or a range of other reasons, people are fleeing for a reason. I think it's important, though, just to note one thing. The majority of refugees do not flee to Europe or the US or the West. They stay in their own countries, or they're staying within their countries nearby. Not every refugee from, say, Syria is aiming to go to New York or London. It doesn't work that way. Yes, many people want to have a better life for their families, and I've got no problem with that whatsoever. But it's a myth that you have millions and millions of people who are, sort of banging on the door of Europe to try to get in.
Right. And thank you so much, Mr. Antony Loewenstein, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Mr. Schalit, going back to you and talking about this divide in Europe, tell us more about it and how it's deepening through with the coming years. How is the issue of consensus, how is the issue of actually having a debate and discourse about immigration, migration just becoming more and more complex?
The whole point of problematizing immigration in Europe at present, particularly in terms of far-right political parties and far-right political, political leaders like Matteo Salvini, is to problematize cultural pluralism. Europe is becoming increasingly diverse. It's looking more and more like the United States. And that's something that far-right political leaders in Europe continually bemoan. The reason why they have to problematize immigration is to make a case for sending people home who already live here and who might be considered Europeans. There is a fear that Europe is culturally disappearing under the weight of its diversity. And the Italian government sounds like it has a lot less experience dealing with diversity than Italy actually has. Italy is internally a very diverse country already, and it always has been.
Right. And Mr. Schalit, hold on to that thought. I introduced another guest who's joined us, Mr. Uli Brueckner, who's a political analyst. He's joining us from Berlin. Thank you so much, Mr. Brueckner, for joining us on the show. Now, while we're talking about this divide and how there is this fear of being invaded by the outsiders in Europe. It's growing. When you talk about migrants, the political right is always fueling a fire and making people fear the other. Now, let's talk about the moral responsibility, if there is any, on Europe when it comes to housing these migrants. I mean, we talked earlier about how these countries in Europe have had an imprint on many countries from which migrants are coming from. How do you think there is a moral responsibility here?
Well, of course, there is a moral responsibility given the fact that we have hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, of colonial history. But we are talking about the European Union that is trying to coordinate an integrated migration policy. And that also includes countries that are very young, that certainly do not have a colonial history. And we have to also take their point of view into consideration. And it is never a good idea to just
And what is their point of view?
Moral responsibility. Pardon?
What is those younger nations' role, and what are they saying about this?
Well, we have something like a divide between Western European countries, including Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, where we clearly see a moral obligation and also a discourse to address this. While on the former eastern side of the Iron Curtain, we have countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, or former Soviet Union countries, republics of the Soviet Union like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And you cannot really tell their population that because of the moral obligation of Europe as a whole, they have to do things that are against their interests.
Right. Actually, just a last question to you before we progress with this discussion. When we talk about the migration crisis, we're hearing about Italy. Italy also seemed to oppose this latest move. They said that they don't want to be a part of it. But at the same time, do you think that there is a legitimate reason for them to reject trying to find a solution? Because in the past, they have been responsible for housing a very, very significant amount of refugees and migrants coming from the shores.
Italy's refusal to back the new agreement and take part in the discussions what is in fact an ideological objection. While Italy in the past has demanded an equitable redistribution of migrants who land on its shores, it is increasingly saying that it objects to redistribution because it does not want Africans and Middle Easterners arriving in Europe, period. It would prefer to pursue a policy of repatriating everyone that lands on its shores to Libya. Which has been a longstanding Italian policy, which long precedes the current government. It was this policy was inaugurated by Matteo Salvini's mentor, Silvio Berlusconi.
Mr. Schalit, very quickly, so when Italy is talking about the fact that it has bear the brunt of all these migrants and other European states never supported it, should the outside world believe it? Should people in Europe believe that narrative?
No, I've worked covering Italian politics for almost 20 years, and I know Matteo Salvini's rhetoric quite well. And I think the best approach to understanding where Salvini is coming from is to simply doubt him on these matters most, if not all, of the time. Matteo Salvini is a very clever politician, and everything he says has several layers to it that you have to analyze for their nuances.
Right. And thank you so much, Mr. Schalit, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Uli Brueckner, on that point, that Italy's narrative about bearing the brunt of migrants and refugees should be taken with a pinch of salt. Do you agree with that?
Well, Italy has a point that we didn't really work in the last 20 years when a problem like this was on the horizon. A coherent European solution that takes into consideration that the immediate effects of migration are at the border and not in the mainland of the European continent. And this has never been addressed, and specifically not in the so-called Dublin Agreement, in which countries in the center of the European Union do not even have to take asylum seekers, because they have to apply for asylum in so-called safe third countries. And for example, in Germany, every country around Germany is considered safe. So they have a case. On the other hand, populist governments instrumentalize migration. And the reason why they are in power is that they play with the fears of people, and they essentially need a migration crisis or construct one to stay in power.
Right. On that point, I'd also like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Alexis Poland, who's a political analyst. He's joining us from Paris. Welcome to the show, Mr. Poland. Now, while we're talking about this new policy that Macron and 14 other states have come up with, we don't know the details of it yet, but our analysts before stated that it probably won't stick. Now, when we talk about everything that is going on in the Europe, will there be a solution when it comes to migration in the near future with this power struggle?
Well, there has to be, because migration is the biggest stake for Europe for the past years, and it will be if nothing changes. There have been many summits, European summit, where we had this kind of declaration saying that, well, things will change. We have an agreement with the 14, the 20, the 10, whatever. And in the end, what we've seen so far was inaction. And after the words, the actions were very far from the speeches. And what has been the strategy of many European countries and Brussels is not in there, because the Commission has been trying to push to get a solution, but each country is very wary about having more migrants coming to their countries. So so far it's been a deal with Turkey on one side and a deal with Libya on the other side, and more Frontex people to stop man the seas and prevent people from entering Europe. The problem is that in Europe, you have countries like Italy or Poland or Hungary that are on the border of Europe and at the first front of migration, and they have a very different vision of migration compared to Germany, France, and others. And,
right.
And unless we find a solution with those very different countries, there is no solution.
Right. And Mr. Uli Brueckner, on that point, unless a solution is found, how do you think that's possible with so many competing ideologies? They don't seem to be reconciling anytime soon.
Well, the European Union has always been great to combine different topics and different understandings of, in this case, for example, what is solidarity. It's not about we find a solution or we don't find a solution, but we keep working on the 6, let's say, construction sides, like a legal framework, an approach to integration, a resettlement of people who are already there, and addressing the root causes in the countries where they come from to get closer to what could be considered an appropriate solution.
Right. When we're talking about asylum seekers reaching Europe, what does European law state about it right now? What needs to be reworked about the legislation?
Well, as I pointed out before, the so-called Dublin Agreement puts too much of a burden on the countries where refugees arrive. And this is very unfair, and it also doesn't address all the other related issues like what needs to be provided as integration policy, which is even a question for generations, not only the people who arrive, but also what can we do as a titular nation to give them a chance to become active citizens in our democratic systems. We also have to think about burden sharing, and burden sharing is not just about money, it's also about how many refugees can be integrated in what kind of socioeconomic environment. That needs to take into consideration how rich a region is, or what the unemployment rate is, or how homogeneous a society is. So there are a number of unrelated topics at first sight that need to be addressed to make it an integrated migration policy concept.
Right. And Mr. Poland, we've been talking everything at a very state level. When we talk about the culture, individualistic culture of each European state, what the people say, their sentiments, and as it's being talked about that refugees shouldn't just be housed, they should be integrated. Do you think there is widespread sentiment for that?
Well, there is. The problem is what do you mean by integration? I mean, it's very tricky. You can't just ask someone who comes from a country to just leave all this culture and everything at the door and turn to be a new person with a new culture. Integration is about a dialogue of culture. So you have to respect the culture of the person coming in, but you also have to explain what the culture of the country you're in is about. And integration also means a full picture. It's about education, it's about employment, it's about the state of welcome racism in each state. It's the openness of the people, and it's very a difficult balance to strike every time, because what you tend to do, refugee or not, I mean, you have people coming from France or the UK who are diplomats, and when they go abroad, most of the time they stick together with people of their kind. They might try sometime to get there, but trying to fully integrate the culture of the country you're in is very difficult. It's not something that is happening in one day or in the hour. It takes time, and it's also depending on the way you perceive this country. If you're welcomed, it helps. If you're not welcome, it's very difficult then to just integrate this culture.
Right. And the dominant culture, while we talk about how the right-wing governments have gained so much power, do you think that the culture is allowing for that, any of that to happen at the moment?
Of course not. That's the point I wanted to make. Is if you get these xenophobic leaders coming all over Europe saying that the problem is refugees, the problem is the foreigners coming to steal our jobs, then integration is impossible, not because of the refugees coming, but because of the xenophobic people with their stand saying that we don't want to integrate these people. We don't want these people coming from abroad. We want to close the borders and kick these people out of our countries. And if you say that, then you got a lot of people who will just stick to the rules and go even a little further, and you get violence, you get murders, and you get all sorts of things that prevent integration, and the country is burning.
Right. And on that note, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Alexis Poland, for joining us from Paris. And thank you so much, Mr. Uli Brueckner, for joining us from Berlin. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.